Good morning. This is a very short microphone. Okay, so I have a subversive plan with this talk, and that's to encourage you as representatives of organizations that implement standards, whether you know it or not, to get involved in the process. Some of the standards I'll mention, I won't point fingers at them, really have failed due to lack of real-world operational input. Standards development tends to self-select for a mindset of people who like to debate this kind of stuff, rather than a skill set of the people who actually do the implementation. And I'd really like to see that break open and get broader participation in the process. It doesn't require deep technical skill to participate. I've been engaged in this part of the information ecosystem, and I'm not an IT engineer. I am, by education, a medieval English history major with a library science degree. Now, I'm going to do my best to keep the acronym soup to a minimum, but there's no escaping it entirely. And if you want one of the acronyms clarified that I missed an expansion of, just let me know. Also really proud of myself that I'm figuring out how to use a Windows machine. So we always need to share information, from quipus to books, punch cards to digital media. We have information that needs to move across space and time. Regardless of whether it's knotted strings or quantum signals, there must be a common understanding to be able to both record and interpret information at a later date. Now, we've lost the common understanding for things like quipus, and I wonder how long it will take to lose that common understanding for punch cards. But that's what standards are all about. It's a shared, specific understanding on how to exchange information. So how are standards developed? Well, it depends. There are many different types of standards organizations, which are also known as standards bodies, standards development organizations, standards developing organizations, and standards setting organizations. And perhaps we need to standardize on what we call these things. I call them SDOs. So there are treaty-based standards organizations, such as the International Organization for Standardization, known as ISO, the International Telecommunication Union, the ITU. There's various national standards bodies and various regional standards bodies. There's also industry and sector-based SDOs, such as the Internet Engineering Task Force, the World Wide Web Consortium, OASIS, the Research Data Alliance, the International Digital Publisher Forum, and many, many more. There are also things that look like standards or sort of smell like standards, but they're not quite yet. They're not being produced by any recognized standards body. And those are often referred to as de facto standards, an example of which would be perhaps ORCID. And so this is the nice thing about standards, is there's so many to choose from. So my main focus when it comes to standards is as a standards publisher. Standards publishing is and isn't like scholarly publishing. Each standards organization defines its own rules for how standards are developed, reviewed, edited, and published. There is generally a peer review process, but it's the SDO that will define who counts as a peer, not the publisher itself. Some SDOs assign editors to work within a working group throughout the entire development process. Others depend on editors only after a document has been approved by that particular community and/or the steering groups for that organization. Others have no formally trained editors whatsoever. All that expertise actually comes out of the working group itself. So I think you can generally tell how much money a standards organization has by where they put editors in this whole process. Now, some SDOs offer their standards out to the world for free. Other paywall access or provide early access only to paid members. It's a mix of models with supporters on all sides, and there's questions about how this business model works in each, kind of like open access versus not. Many SDOs also have what I'll call multiple titles. They publish more than just technical standards. They publish best practices, purely informational material, using the RFC series as an example, and I'll talk a bit more later about the RFC series and how it relates to the Internet Engineering Task Force. there's different tracks for different types of material and even different origination points. But people equate RFC with standard and IETF. It's not correct, but they do it. We have a similar problem with the W3C, where people think everything the W3C publishes must be a standard. It's not. Some of them are, some of them aren't, but all the titles munge together, and it's an active debate within the community on how to educate non-standards people as to the difference between what's a standard and what's just guidance. So one of the questions that has frequently come up in my hearing about standards publishing is, why have SDOs at all? Why not just post directly on a wiki or something like that? The standards development process often takes a long time, and people get really impatient because, you know, this is the information age. We need the information now, today, perhaps yesterday, possibly even last week. But first you have to identify the need for a standard. You need to find the right people to work on it. You need to find the right people to test the implementation of it, and then you need to get it published. And all of this ends up taking a fair amount of time. There are very few people who actually work on standards development for a living. People usually have day jobs, and I think that's actually a really good thing. Standards need to be grounded in reality and have a broad set of experiences if they're going to be successful. And by successful, I mean actually implementable and something that does encourage interoperability. Standards also need to be reviewed. One person writing this isn't qualifying as review because there's not actually that many Einsteins in the world. Most work benefits from having multiple eyes, multiple brains, actually looking at it and considering the implications of whatever's going on. And last but not least, you could post something on a wiki or on your favorite website, but once you start touching on standards, you're also touching a lot on IPR issues. And frankly, it's better to have an infrastructure that can handle IPR issues, hold copyright, develop IPR policies, and that's probably a bit more than any one person's going to do on their, their favorite personal website. So let's talk about some examples of standards organizations that directly or indirectly touch on the publishing community. There's the National Information Standards Organization called NISO. This is a nonprofit accredited by the American National Standards Institute, which doesn't mean it's about American standards. Representatives from organizations around the world and other national and regional standards organizations participate in developing these standards. Some of the standards you might recognize, JATS, the Journal Article Tagging Suite. Coming out of that, the standards tagging suite, that's under development right now. There's also things for metrics, such as sushi and counter sushi. The MARC record, if you don't know what a MARC record is, trust me, your library community definitely does. And they do a lot more than that. They also do work on abstracts, archiving, information exchange. There's a lot of good work out there that you can see online for free. Another example is the Research Data Alliance. Now, there's a rather desperate need for efficiency in the big data space. Searching through data takes vast computational resources. Storing this data itself gets pretty darn expensive. Archiving and maintaining the data over a long period of time is kind of insane. This is an area that really just begs for standardization, and this is a group that's a good model for SDOs that develop out of sort of grassroots effort. This was researchers, the ones that were holding this data, trying to figure out how on earth can we work with this material across disciplines, across research groups. I was actually at an early meeting that announced this SDO getting started. They were talking about being another working group in another SDO so that they didn't have to set up all this infrastructure, and they were talking about the IETF and doing this. But they decided they wanted a different IPR framework and potentially a faster turnaround time because, everything is so slow. Well, I don't think they found the speed that they were looking for because they hit the same complexities that every other standards organization hits. But they have adjusted the IPR rules to meet their specific needs, and the IPR rules say if the material isn't open, you can't use it. Their business model depends on organizational members who pay an annual fee, but the work, however, is done by volunteers. So if you are interested in this space, you essentially go to their website and say, yes, I agree with your guiding principles about supporting open access to data, and poof, you're in, and you can start participating. Now, as soon as you mention the words web and standards, you should be thinking of the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C. The W3C was formed in 1994 by Sir Tim Berners-Lee after he left CERN. He did some work through the IETF in the mid-90s. You'll find his name on several RFCs that describe things like HTTP, describes the structure for URNs, URIs, URLs. However, politics, impatience with the process, because darn it, these things take so long, and a desire to make standards that were actually a little closer to the user than what normally comes out of the IETF, I think we're at the core of the reasons to create yet another SDO and creating the W3C. There's liaisons between the W3C and other standards organizations, which is not at all uncommon to have those kinds of relationships so that the SDOs can avoid competing standards when they want to avoid competing standards. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they don't play well with each other. So today, the W3C is particularly interested in making the web more than just your basic reading platform. There's ongoing work around developing the standards for CSS, HTML, SVG, basically graphics information, and a lot more, as well as work around internationalization and accessibility. And in particular, they want to make the web work for publishers. For that last bit, there's a digital publishing interest group that's currently working on trying to define what a portable web publication should be. I'm actually holding the pen on collecting use cases for that. They know that the web needs to be able to support more than just those things that you see on a page. You need to be able to review things online, offline, and you need to do a lot more with personalization of that material, regardless of where it sits, than any format can currently handle today. Quite a lot of work's going on there. There's also, and this is something that starts to blend things together, there's discussions about the W3C and the IDPF merging. It's still under discussion, but you may have seen that in the news. And what that might mean from a more practical perspective is that the EPUB standard will move under the W3C. It's not a done deal yet, but it's actively being considered and debated within the communities of interest. Now, since I mentioned the IETF a few times in relation to the Research Data Alliance and the W3C and the RFC series, and since I'm the publisher for the IETF, I did want to say just a few words about this SDO. Its focus is not on publishing, and yet publishers, as well as everybody else that uses the internet, deals with standards from this SDO every single day. Now, from a legal perspective, the IETF does not exist. It is not a legal entity. All documents, there is no membership, there are no fees. If you'd like to participate, you join a mailing list and pretty much just dive right in. Sponsors for their meetings, which happen 3 times a year and move around the world, are welcome, but all that funding goes through the Internet Society, which is a legal, not-for-profit entity and the largest single funding source for making IETF meetings happen. The IPR for all of this is held by the IETF Trust, and the IETF Trust was created only for that purpose. That's all that it does, is it's that skeleton that just holds IPR for everything that's going on. So the IETF standards document, as well as informational, experimental, and best practice documents, all of that goes into the RFC series. The RFC series also handles documents for the Internet Architecture Board, the Internet Research Task Force, and independent submissions that come in that are trying to document or provide guidance on Internet activities. The RFC series predates all of these organizations, and in fact, the RFC1 was written by Steve Crocker on how to create a host-to-host network, and that's commonly looked at as that's where the internet got its start. So there's a few areas I wanted to highlight, which, while perhaps not what people traditionally think of when they think of web technologies, and they're not standards in and of themselves, this is where the implementation happens. This is a lot that's now critical to using the web, and especially for the research community, which is another group that I guess I would say another sector that I work in. So in particular, I'm going to highlight identity and access management, data and user privacy, and some collaboration tools. I'm familiar with these areas more in my role as project manager and technical editor for various open source projects. Richard, the next speaker, is going to go into a bit more detail on identity and access management. So yeah, I'm switching hats here a bit, since these areas are beyond what I handle as RFC series editor. For me, it's hard to think about IAM when your community has no boundaries, has no membership. I mean, where do you draw the line of who's in and who's out? You can't really do it. Also, a goodly part of my standards community are security experts who are morally opposed to being tracked in any way, shape, or form. And we affectionately say that they source their tinfoil for their hats from multiple locations so they can't be tracked. But that's fine, because as a publisher, I'd really rather not be responsible for user accounts. But it's one thing to say, I don't want to support user accounts, and another thing to say that everyone can access everything on my site, especially if there's things like editable wikis or documents involved. So, allowing authenticated access that in turn allows for intelligent authorization decisions without having to manage user accounts, that means federated identity management. And that's a really active space, both in standards development and in practical implementation. You might be familiar with it as you go to a site that says, here, enter your username and password, or click on Google or Facebook. That is federated identity management. But sometimes Google and Facebook are perhaps not as assured as you would possibly want. Perhaps you want more assurance that the user is actually a student and therefore, deserves the discounts that one might get as a student from a publisher. Or you might want to say this person is coming in from a library, or that this person is from a particular institution. Again, you're not going to get any kind of level of assurance from social media, social gateways, things like that. So in the US, the InCommon Identity Federation has 854 member institutions that all participate in offering identity providers or having service providers that are registered as part of research and scholarship. And I know several publishers are part of this federation. Out of curiosity, how many folks in this group know whether they're part of InCommon or not? Any? A couple, like 2. Okay. So that's something that you might want to look into. Other regions of the world also have identity federations that may suit more your particular needs for an area. If you're interested in generalized best practice in this space and finding a common meeting point for all of those federation operators to sit and discuss the latest challenges, this is available through REFEDS, the R&E Federation group. This is an open group that discusses and tries to find solutions for the needs of federations and research communities around the world. It comes out of higher education and research. It's not a commercial service. Again, the membership is joining a mailing list and participating or just lurking to read the discussions of what's going on. All the material is freely available online, and anyone that has an opinion can chime in. REFEDS has started feeding material through the RFC series, in this case through the independent submission stream rather than the IETF itself, which is a great example of how sector expertise can feed into the world of standards. Though I'll have to note, remember when I said standards development organizations don't necessarily publish in all things or standards? This would be an example of that. What REFEDS is pushing is informational documents, best practices, but not standards in and of themselves. So I wanted to touch on the priorities that REFEDS looks at, not because I'm trying to necessarily promote REFEDS, though maybe I am just a little bit, but to say if these kinds of things resonate with what you are worried about in terms of access management to your materials, you may find a community of interest here that you can say, hey, I've got similar problems. I'm curious as to what people think about this. Laura Paglioni out of the ORCID group is an active participant, for example, to try and figure out how ORCID will fit into the overall best practice for identity federation around the world. And other publishers actually participate in this as well, though mostly as lurkers, which is kind of a shame. So this is really just to give you a range of the topics discussed. I'd say that this is actually a pretty common list for even just when you narrow it down to the national or regional identity federations. Most of the topics are discussed from the federation or identity provider level, but that's mostly because we haven't gotten too many service providers or relying parties to chime in and say, well, wait, what about me? What about my needs? Now, that's possibly because those needs are fairly simple. What they need is information. They need the attributes about the users to be released to them so that they can make intelligent decisions, which is a little challenging. And I could go into a lot more detail on that, but this isn't a talk about identity federation and such. And I'd really rather get you motivated on what this kind of stuff can do for you and how you can participate in making it better, rather than discourage you with all the challenges that I know about. So in case you're not convinced that federated identity is a practical thing, let's talk about some of the compelling reasons that we take on the road to convince institutions or research groups or publishers about why you would want to do this. So I need to give a shout out to Ann Harding. Ann Harding is one of the experts of Identity Federation that works for the Swiss Research and Education Identity Federation. User data, and I know you all know this, user data is a very, very valuable resource. It's valuable both to the organizations that hold it and the hackers that want it. But the cost of creating that information and protecting that information is pretty high. There's help desk costs. There's issues that come out of protecting things with stale data. There's the cost of being hacked. There's the cost of preventing your site from being hacked. All of this adds up. It's really better to leave the user data to someone else who has that within their mandate to manage that, who has the opportunity to do more in terms of verifying that this person, it's not just the same person, this person actually is Joe Smith. And you can verify that with whatever material they bring to that particular identity provider. So better to leave the user data to them and have you focus on the services being offered. Now, it's interesting to me how technical standards and legislation can collide. User and data privacy is a space where technology and standards are capable of doing quite a bit, but the challenge has been getting consistent information on what to do, because depending on what region you're in, you're going to get conflicting guidance, and you'll be breaking laws in the EU if you do things the way you would do them in the US. It's a mess, what it boils down to. The internet's a global thing, and research collaboration happens regardless of geopolitical boundaries. So I see this happen on a regular basis. I see this kind of conflict come into place because these research communities, I'll take for an example one that I work with that you may have seen on the news recently, which is called LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. And that's how you know that I work with them, because I can say that name like that. They have memorandums of understandings with research groups in India, in Italy, in Germany, in Scotland, in Japan, all over the world. And they don't care about user and data privacy legislation. What they care about is getting their science done. But all this legislation is built up around perceived needs to protect consumers, and as a result gets in the way of researchers that are actually trying to do their thing. I expect as publishers, you probably see this as well, because you probably publish around the world and you have the same problems. So what I see is user and data privacy being a space where we really need people who understand the problems from a research perspective to be chiming in a bit on standards, but a lot more on legislation to say, here's what we need. Please stop making it hard. Some groups I know are focusing more on the consent space as a way to perhaps marry these things, but consent is its own set of interesting challenges, which I can happily go into more detail, perhaps during the break if anyone's interested. So from there, switching to collaboration platforms. Collaboration, key to research, also a very useful thing when you're talking about peer review and you're trying to get these small groups together to review material. And there are platforms in production, again, coming out of the higher education and research space, which is what I know best, that enable that kind of work while still supporting as best they can user requirements, user privacy requirements. So many standards make this possible, from the HTML5 information identity standards like OAuth, which forms the basis of OpenID Connect. And there's a lot of best practice work coming in around the informed consent. All of it feeds into here. Tools like CoManage, which comes out of work funded by the National Science Foundation and Internet 2, allows things like customized enrollment flows so that you can say, well, I want this group to be very closed and has to be vetted by only these 3 people or just a self-sign-up group, all within the same platform. And any application that can actually externalize its authentication and authorization information can be updated at the time of this person enrolls. So an enrollment will happen, and suddenly the information is just there for a wiki to be updated with the proper authorization information, because now this person is in a group. You'll have your mailing lists updated with proper membership, because it's all happening at one time. I know, like I said, I know publishers have needs in this space, and what I want to make sure doesn't happen is that you don't reinvent stuff that's already out there. This stuff exists, it's open source, it's freely available. If you have similar needs around collaboration, look at some of the stuff that's happening in other sectors and take advantage of it. So the final takeaways, you work with standards every day. You or someone on your team have a lot to offer to make standards more practical and useful in your environment. And you don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. Just because you might not see something in your sector, look at the next sector over. They might be solving many of the same problems, and you can take advantage of that, especially when you're looking at higher education and research, because we love to give stuff away. We're very ivory tower and think money is dirty and business models are scary. So we just throw this out there and hope people will take it up. And with that, here's my contact info. If you want to talk to me about more of the standard side of things, I put my RFC series editor email address up there. If you want to talk to me more about actual implementation of things, I went ahead and put up my Spherical Calc Consulting address up there, and you can contact me however you like. And that's what I've got for today. I think I managed to stay on time.
Yeah, you were perfect. We have time for questions.
Yeah, maybe just one remark, because you refer to like privacy is a mess and that it's like getting in the way of users all over the world. And while that is true on one level, I also think that it's very important and it's important to realize that different countries and different cultures have different views on privacy. So it's not just like because the European States are inherently evil and want to make life difficult for researchers, I don't know, in the States. It's because they have a different conception maybe of privacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I would always compare it to like compliance in finance. So we have like Basel and the other like all these anti-money laundering acts, and you just have to deal with it in finance. And I think it just needs to be the same with authentication and user data. We just have to deal with these things and do them as different compliance issues. And then solution providers like publishers or platform providers need to come up with technical solutions that guidelines.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. I would, if I were queen of the universe, I would therefore then educate not just the publishers and the legislators, but I would also want to educate the researchers who get really irritated when they're trying to do their science and they have to click yet another button to say, I consent or I agree. And there's open questions as to, is that meaningful consent given, if they actually have to do this for their work, where's the balance? Since there's been very little in the way of lawsuits, there's very little definition in this space. The laws haven't been challenged, so that we don't really know the boundaries. It makes implementation of standards and best practice really, really hard. Other questions?
Richard has a question.
Richard.
So, Heather, you mentioned at the beginning of the talk standards that had failed, and then you sort of passed over that a little bit. Would you like to enlighten us a little bit on any of the standards that have failed and why they failed?
Well, one standard that now, a little bit of a disclaimer, I do not implement this particular standard because I don't have a need to measure things the way other people do. But I have heard tell that not everybody in the world is happy with things like counter and sushi and counter sushi as metrics, that they are incredibly difficult to implement, if not practically impossible. I was not involved in developing those standards, but taking some of the other things that I have seen in a much more technical arena, what is likely to have happened is that you have people who have a very limited mindset as to what they were trying to accomplish, and in not actually broadening that out to people who do more in the actual implementation and more use cases, you're going to find something that works for the small people that, small group of people that actually did the implementation and not for anyone else. Okay. Any other? Yes, ma'am? Mm-hmm.
Do any of it. Is there a rubric out there that tells us this is what the standards are going to use, what they're appropriate for and not appropriate for? Does anybody know that tool or is
I don't think so, because it would be great to have such a thing, but very few people have that sort of broad view of what's happening across so many. There are a lot of standards organizations, what's happening on all of them, and who's to judge whether they are successful or a failure. That gets to be really sensitive material. People get a little testy if you tell them that the standard that they worked on for 6 years is, I think the official word is crap. So it's, frankly, the way I find out all of this stuff is that I come to these meetings where you can say a whole lot more about it and just learn from people's practical experience.
Can I ask you a question? So where would you go right now when you were confronted with a question about what standard might apply, how you ought to be approaching a problem? Where would you go?
Works for me. Well, I would actually change that around, is how many people actually think about what standards would handle the situation. I mean, there's a number of people, if they're not familiar with the standard space, it wouldn't occur to them to look for a standard to solve the problem.
That was my point. And
yeah.
I think in areas where the industry and the community has sort of got a sense that there's an undercurrent, that there is a flow, I think Jack's is a good example. It's one topic, one problem space that enough people know about it. That's the first thing that comes to their mind when they're confronted with a problem in that arena. In so many of these other topics, there's nothing coming to the top of your mind when you're I don't know how to solve that.
Well, that's kind of why I put forward me having this session, because I see this as a space where it would be really useful if a broader audience knew about it, and they don't. I was at the STM meeting a couple years ago, talking to one of the more technical individuals there, and he's like, you know, I've never even heard of the IETF. So what are you talking about? I'm like, well, let me ask you this. Have you heard of HTTP? And he's like, well, yeah, of course. I said, SMTP for email? He said, yeah. I said, handle system which underlies DOIs? Sure. I said, all that came out of the IETF. And he thought for a minute, and he says, wow, you guys have a serious marketing problem. And I said, yeah, we kind of do.
I want to flip Richard's question quickly. And ask if there is a standard or set of standards that everybody should be using.
Everybody? Could you narrow down everybody for me? Publishers?
Sure.
Okay. No? Okay. I mean, there's ones that you should be looking at, and now's the opportunity where you can participate in them to make sure that they meet your needs when they come out. I'm going to point now to the W3C's Digital Publishing Interest Group as a really good place to get a word in, a use case in, as we try and define this portable web publication idea, which is taking what worked for EPUB, what didn't work for EPUB, what worked for PDF, what didn't work for PDF, what worked for HTML, what didn't work for HTML, and try and make something better.
I'm going to throw one in there actually. Maybe this is one, Chuck, that you might want to you might want to contradict me on. But what I heard was that it's actually quite hard for Crossref to understand when a DOI is pointing to a page that no longer exists, like a 404 type error. Is that something that publishers need to take on board a standard about, or is that not a problem anymore?
Oh, it's a problem. I don't want to say it's a huge problem. I think that there's probably a couple of percent of DOIs out there that don't go anywhere anymore. So it's a relatively small number, but I think 2% is way too big. We do crawl publisher sites looking for busted landing pages, and we do put together reports on our web page that identify these things, and we make them available to publishers. Quite honestly, we get less than enthusiastic uptake on reviewing that data.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a problem that we're always going to have to monitor and tend to.
Mm-hmm.
Just the nature of the beast.
Yeah. Bruce?
I want to actually follow up on Elizabeth's question and sort of loop back to your question earlier. Sorry, I don't know your name. I think every publishing organization needs to have at least a few people in-house who, for lack of a better term, are standards wonks who make a point of following some of this. I think, as Heather pointed out, IETF is important to follow. I think for people who are in the solid publishing realm, also, and full disclosure, I'm a former board member of NISO, following NISO, and they've got, we didn't talk about your newsletters that come out once a month, is, I think, vitally important. Understand not just what standards are out there, what standards are in the pipeline, but also, as we'll talk more in the second half of the session, how some of these standards start to interact with each other and understanding that in the big picture. And then making sure they get properly implemented in the organization. I think coming back to what Chuck was just saying, one of the challenges publishers face is that they've got all these different standards, and it's tough to stay on top of all of them, but it's vitally important to avoid that 2% that Chuck was just talking about, to make sure that you're actually implementing properly. And wherever possible, trying to get tough on. One of the things, SFP listserv is a great way to start raising a question. I'm having problems with this. Anyone have any suggestions or ideas? And often get really good with that. So plugs for a few organizations.
Sorry, what listserv is that?
SSP? Oh, I think I'm hosting this conference.
Yeah, right?
Good point, Bruce. Any other questions?
Does SSP have a sort of technical group? You know, they have their own website group. Is there a committee for ongoing technical issues? Sorry if I'm out of loop on that.
I
Maybe I can answer that. So typically what the board does is calls them on task forces for things like the website, for things like creation of the data dashboard and other types of things that the board or the committees put in requests for. But there is no equivalent of like the SDN's Future Lab or even a lot of the NISO groups. So that might be something worth exploring.
How do we ask for one? How do we make one?
Just ask, I'll take it back for the board after this. So.
Sweet. Okay, thank you all very much.